Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Alice Kaplan, who is John M. Musser Professor of French. A specialist of 20th century France, Professor Kaplan works at the intersection of literature and history using a method that allies archival research with textual analysis. A writer and a literary translator, she served on the advisory board of the National Book Foundation's study of the state of translation in the United States, which resulted in the establishment of a National Book Award in translated literature. Today we'll talk with Professor Kaplan about her recent book titled Looking for the Stranger, Albert Camus and the Life of a Literary Classic, as well as some of the issues involved in translating books. Welcome, Professor Kaplan.
Glad to be here.
Let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Looking for the Stranger is just that. I'm trying to account for the life of this mysterious and wonderful book, Albert Camus' The Stranger. I think probably since the 1950s, this has been the French novel that our students read, not just to learn French, because it's often taught, for example, to teach the past tense, but to learn how to be a thinking person.
Okay.
It has a unique status in the canon of French literature. And there have been hundreds, thousands maybe, interpretations of the novel. And I thought, what would happen if instead of giving one more interpretation, I told the history of the book, how it was made, under what conditions was it published, how did it become such a phenomenal success across the globe? It was published at the very worst moment for French publishing, in the depths of the Nazi occupation. And Camus was an unemployed and very ill with tuberculosis, writer in the boondocks of Algeria. It really is a miracle book.
Yes, it sounds fascinating. And why do you think it's such an iconic book to the French?
Well, first of all, there's its style. It's almost changed the evolution of the novel. It's written in a very flat and plain language, and the narrator, Musser, expresses very little emotion until the end of the book. And you try to understand, who is this guy? What is he really thinking? You see nothing of his interior. You only see his response to the world. And there's something about it that makes the world around him so clear, and that makes people long to understand him. So he is known in France and in the United States too as the ultimate existentialist character.
I see. And what led you to write this book?
Well, I think I'm not very different than most Americans who study French. The very first novel I ever read in French, proudly, was Camus' The Stranger. I read it in a French camp in Bar Harbor, Maine, when I was 15 years old. It stuck with me. I think I've read it 100 times since. I've taught it at all levels. And it's the book of my life.
And how did you do the research? And doing the research, did anything strike you differently after having read the book so many times, and that you learned something new?
What I've always said is that I was taught The Stranger with absolutely no knowledge of the fact that it took place in Algeria. And you know, during the 90s, you couldn't go to Algeria because they were in the midst of a very violent civil war. Now you can. So the first thing I did when I started working on the book was to go to Algiers, where Camus grew up, and to look at all the places where he had lived, both when he was living in the setting of the novel in this working class neighborhood of his childhood, and the places where he lived when he wrote the novel. And seeing those places changed everything for me.
In what way?
I could imagine him absorbing the ambience of Algiers, of working class Algiers, and I could go on the beach where the famous fight took place between Musser and the Arab that resulted in the death of the Arab. It was, some of it is almost impossible to describe, just a feeling of being close to the writer. And then, of course, I also read all his correspondence during the period when he was writing, and his diaries. He kept not intimate diaries, but work-in-progress diaries. So you could actually see the way the book almost came alive without him even intending it. He was working on another book altogether, and he's suddenly seeing these images of a man condemned to death.
And where are these diaries now?
Well, they're all published. They're called notebooks, Camus notebooks. There are 3 volumes of them, and they've been translated, all 3 volumes. They're just a wonderful tool for getting closer to Camus' process as a writer.
Right, right. So as someone, and I know you are fluent in French, but as someone who is not fluent in French, reading an English translation, and you having read both, what are some of the issues that you come across, or some things that you think of? And I know in reading your book, you make note about the stranger, the title itself meaning, you know, an outsider or a foreigner, and maybe not so much the stranger. So speak to that
Those
a little
are great
bit.
questions, because in fact there are 2 titles for the stranger. The American edition is always called The Stranger. The British is always called The Outsider. Now, some people like to argue that Meursault, the main character, is not a stranger. He's an outsider, a kind of alienated outsider in society. And he's also a French citizen in a colonial society. So these terms become so complicated. The very first translator of The Stranger into English, for both the English and the American editions, was a man named Stuart Gilbert, a quite eminent translator who translated Malraux and other great writers. He really tried to make the book sound normal, more normal than it is. So Camus wrote a lot of his sentences in indirect discourse, and Stuart Gilbert liked to change those into quoted material, so you actually hear the voice of a person saying something. And Camus was really shocked when he first saw the American edition. He paged through it and he said, "I don't remember so many quotation marks in the original." And it was unfaithful. That translation was unfaithful. Then in the 1980s, a very gifted translator named Matthew Ward retranslated the novel, and that's the edition that I would recommend to people. He understands all the odd things Camus was doing with language.
Interesting. I was going to ask you what you think the best version of is, so I'm glad you told us that. As a translator, what are some of the things that you consider when you're working on translating something?
Well, you know, the saying goes that only 3% of the books published in the United States are translations. And I think that is probably a stronger figure than the real figure. It is so hard to get a book translated. And so a lot of my energy goes into talking to publishers about books that I think are really wonderful. It's called, there's an expression in French, un passeur. I'm a passeur. I try to get books to cross over into English. I was just working on a beautiful Algerian novel called Alger le Cri, and it's really an essay about living in the city of Algiers. He talks about the city of Algiers as a woman. He says Algiers, she, which works well in French because the word for city is feminine, but we don't have the masculine and the feminine. So the first draft, I had it all as a she, you know, and my editor said, I don't know, people might think you're just not a very good speaker of English and you don't understand. We don't say she, we say it for the city. So I had to come up with a device to make the reader understand that I knew that Algiers is not a she in English, but that it was an intentional choice.
Right. So here at Yale, you've recently founded a new project called the Translation Initiative. Tell us a little bit about that and what you see as its mission and some of its goals.
So the mission of the Macmillan Translation Initiative is to bring issues of translation together in one spot. We did a study of the faculty. I'm working on this initiative with Harold Augenbraum. We discovered that there are something like 360 members of the faculty at all levels, at all schools, all across the campus, whose research involves translation in one way or another. And that translation is much bigger than literary translation. People in computer science are very interested. I mean, as we know, there's now Google Translate, so they're fascinating theoretical issues about whether you can build a translation machine. People in the military are very concerned with interpreting and translation. I mean, there's not a field in which translation doesn't live. And so we are reaching out to people across the campus. We're designing working groups. We're publicizing events so that if somebody's interested in translation in any way, they can come to us.
Okay, well, we will look forward to hearing more of that initiative, and I thank you for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
It was a pleasure, and thank you to the Macmillan, Marilyn.
Okay. For more information about Professor Kaplan and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you so much.